both invitation and element of surprise. This is not simply an invitation to do good works, but one of reorganizing our very perception of the world so that we might see what is already good and name it out loud. As Parker states, it is an act of recognition, a confession of surprise, a grateful acknowledgement that in the midst of a broken world, unspeakable beauty, grace, and mystery abide. I have been pondering these words throughout the past few weeks during this time of crisis, pandemic, time when the suffering and brokenness around us has cast bleak shadows over the world. A time when too often callous words and acts of violence devalue life. The search for beauty and grace comes to us like a deliberate act of resistance, a refusal to be carried under the tides of injustice and despair. Amidst the persistent disregard for life is a continual act of faith to choose to regard our existence on earth as something holy, something worthy of being protected and preserved. What Parker names this act of faith and witness, blessing the world. And in blessing, I picture not in the orthodox sense of words or prayers, not a priest sprinkling holy water around a church, but I imagine a practice of attention, like a nature photographer waiting for hours in the bushes beside a wetland for just the right image of a swan to appear. Or a matter of intention, like the bud of a rose slowly growing, deepening in color over many days, and then unfurling its petals and opening to the sun. I imagine our human choices made with that same attention and intention to love life, small acts of kindness, a phone call, a loaf of bread, doctors and nurses at the bedside of the dying, the person who speaks out boldly against acts of racism and sexism, the ones who imagine and plant seeds for a new world to come. To bless the world is an act of naming, nurturing, and offering that which is good, our undivided attention. And it is every act that we do to help that grace and beauty grow. And I believe that this work of blessing the world is not easy, and it opens our hearts to a place that is often vulnerable and tender, a place that could take us to a threshold of life, a space between joy and loss. It is an act of risk to open ourselves to beauty and grace in times of despair. A few years ago, I had the experience of working as a hospital chaplain, completing a unit of clinical pastoral education. And I often encountered people at that place of vulnerability, where even the smallest amount of hope could be dangerous. And where, for so many, the act of noticing, just noticing and holding small moments of beauty and grace became sustenance. A prayer, a kind word, sunlight through the windows. Those were blessings that mattered. And there was one particular story that comes to mind during that time of hospital chaplaincy, and it was the middle of the night when I received a call from labor and delivery. I was called to be with a mother who had delivered and lost a baby. This was early in my seminary education, and I was really, do we ever know how to respond? And I questioned my own capacity to hold the pain of that situation, wondering what blessing could I offer. But the blessing of that moment came from the woman who I visited, It came far beyond the prayers that I offered or the touch. It came through this grief and sadness, through her tender heart, as she held and caressed the tiny one wrapped in blankets, offering words of love to her child, honoring the life that had not lived, lamenting and raging in grief. And through that night of listening, I heard her process the pain and loss in her life. And even though she swore she was not religious, I heard her declare a statement of faith as she said, I want to keep my heart open to life. Here was a choice to bless the world, not the words I spoke, but the words a new mother offered to life, that she would not turn to despair, that she would continue to choose life, continue to open and to allow herself to feel, even in the midst of pain, allow herself to grieve, and to crawl through that mess into goodness. And I believe this is the choice we are called to make over and over again throughout our lives, that willingness to be vulnerable, to open ourselves in spite of the many times we have been hurt, and to feel, to choose to bless the world. I reflected afterwards that night, and others like it in the hospital, about my own theology of blessing. A theology that is rooted in the Unitarian Universalist tradition and in the sacredness of life here on earth. And in fact, pointing beyond at a distant God who might throw down curses or blessings upon us seems like an easy out for humanity. I've heard some of those theological responses pointing to the earth as the cleanser of humanity, as the virus, as the dispenser of judgment. And I find them very distant from our Unitarian and Universalist roots. Unitarian roots that affirm the seed of goodness in human beings, and Universalist ones that recognize a benevolent source. While those seeds have grown into a new faith that we share today, they are essentially part of our DNA that continues to call us to notice and love life, and to act for justice, believing in our own power collectively as human beings to make change. This theology that tells me that we are empowered as responsible moral agents to co-create a just, beautiful, sustainable world. Power that is in our hands, as Rebecca Parker points to, so many gifts that each one of us possess, so much power that can be used to feed the hungry, bind up wounds, welcome the stranger, praise what is sacred, do the work of justice, and offer love. And we can choose. This is not to say that we are magicians casting blessings like spells, but perhaps more akin to mothers, to those who nurture and strengthen and help to grow what is already present, the goodness that is already there. Those who protect what is fledgling and young by holding it securely in our arms. Rebecca Parker, in her book, Blessing the World, adds these words: "We are not inherently self-interested individuals. We are connected to one another, and caring for others is fundamental to our existence. The purpose of life is not our own well-being in isolation from all others. Our well-being enters into the well-being of others, adding a measure of health and joy. Our actions matter to us and also to all the world. We live both for ourselves and for one another. The purpose of life, then, is to discover the joy or well-being that simultaneously pleases us and blesses our neighbor. Every act that we commit is a contribution to our world. The question is whether our actions will be a blessing or a curse. The basic question of life is not, what do I want, but rather, what do I want to give?" Those words from Rebecca Parker. So for some, this choice to bless the world is a daily practice, and it is embedded in religious tradition. It's embedded in our Unitarian Universalist roots and in other traditions as well that we can learn from. I look also to the mystical school of Kabbalah in Hasidic Judaism, the hundreds of blessings in that tradition, prayers spoken to correspond to ordinary activities throughout the day. Blessed are you, Yah, for making me in your image. Blessed are you, Yah, who clothes the naked. Litanies of blessings going on and on, moments of praise and honoring the sacred in the ordinary motions of life. Well, this practice of blessing is rooted in the Kabbalah's teaching of Tikkun Olam, which is our collective task of sustaining and repairing the world. The Kabbalah teaches that at some point in the beginning of things, the holy was broken up into countless sparks which were scattered throughout the universe. And there is a spark in everyone and everything. The holy, hidden in the ordinary, and may speak to us at any time. And so those blessings, Hasidic teaching follows, are speaking back that language into the universe. Each blessing is considered a moment of mindfulness and an acknowledgement that the sacred is present and has been met in ordinary life. As we bless the world, we strengthen what is good and holy, doing our part to bring those pieces back together. I've read about Tikkun Olam in many sources, and one of those is from the Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen in her book, My Grandfather's Blessings, a book in which she draws upon those lessons from her Hasidic grandfather as she writes about learning to serve and bless life through her own work as a doctor and a healer. And as she says, when we recognize the spark of God in others, we blow on it with our attention and strengthen it, no matter how deeply it has been buried or for how long. When we bless someone, we touch the unborn goodness in them and wish it well. Rachel learned this lesson from her grandfather, that we strengthen and feed life through blessing, just as water does for a plant. And as a doctor and healer, she goes on to translate those blessings into acts of service that we do for one another, and the great attention of listening and paying attention. Blessings that help us become more fully ourselves and serve the wholeness in life. A blessing as a moment of meeting, a place for wholeness in our relationships, enabling people to remember who they are. It was 13 and a half years ago that I read that book from Rachel Remen, and I remember it very well because I read it while I was in labor with my now 13-year-old daughter, Elisa Grace. I read it on November 17th, 2006, and as I skimmed through the pages now, my copy of this book, I come to pages where I wrote down my contractions on the timing of each on those pages over the course of a couple hours. So it was Rachel's blessings that accompanied me into the delivery room. And more than any other moment in my life, I think that motherhood has taught me, thrust me into the middle of my own vulnerability and that continual choice to choose to bless the world and to serve life. Because I connect that moment, I connect the birth of my daughter and raising her and her sister with my vocation in ministry. It was that same year, 2006, that I watched Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. It was that same year that the war in Iraq was occurring and continuing to pay its price in lost lives. And those events that were happening in our world brought me back to my own call, and how am I called to choose to bless the world? What kind of world am I bringing my daughter into? And as I prepared for today's sermon, I thought back to that pivotal year. And it's a year that I'll never forget, that particular Mother's Day. And that Mother's Day, I was in Rochester, New York, living in Rochester, New York, attending the First Unitarian Church of Rochester. And on the newspaper, the front page of the newspaper that year, there was a picture of a woman and a man who I knew who were my neighbors growing up. And they were weeping over the coffin of their son, Army Specialist Teodoro Torres, also known as Tito, who had been killed in Iraq by a roadside bomb. And on the pages of that newspaper, the headline read, "Until later, dear son." And I was swarming with grief, as well as that benevolent rage of injustice, even as life continued to grow in me. And I remember going into the Unitarian Universalist Church that morning and hearing one of the most meaningful sermons of my life, a minister speaking of the tension between motherhood and that call to act in the world, naming the tension between the personal and the political, and the call to bless the world that is both intimate and public in its witness. I felt the stirrings of new life and a call to responsibility for the world I was birthing my child into. And I experienced how that personal love can break us open to a whole world. So we are called to bless the world, to open our hearts wide, whether you yourself are a parent or a grandparent, an aunt or an uncle, or a gardener, or a teacher, or a doctor, or a nurse. You may know that the work of growing, nurturing life, and vulnerability come together. And regardless of what your job or vocation may be, we are all invited to listen to the voices of mothers who have called out from a revolutionary love, lifting up the sanctity of life. While there is justice or evil, there moves a holy disturbance, a revolutionary love, a benevolent rage, protesting, urging, insisting that which is sacred will not be defiled. And I find in that benevolent rage, also in our protesting and in our standing up for justice, that heart of blessing. I'm reminded of our Unitarian ancestor, Julia Ward Howe, who in 1870 proclaimed in a Mother's Day proclamation a clarion call for women to join together to speak out for peace. She said, "Arise now, women of the day, from the bosom of this devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice." And Howe had a feminist belief that women had a responsibility to shape the society politically. She tied this conviction into the deep love they held for their children. She called on women to meet together, to work together in a council for peace, to end wars. As she wrote, "We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs." So I look to these examples of our history, from the stories of our lives, in this day and age when the value of human life is being debated on the public stage. A legacy of standing for lost children collectively continues, and the call, the cries are coming from many places. I'm thinking today, the legacy, the continuing cries of Black mothers, the mothers of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud, a young Black man who was shot down by two white men who chased him in a pickup truck while he was jogging through his neighborhood 2 months ago outside Brunswick, Georgia, a murder that would have been a cover-up if the video had not been shared in the national press, if that benevolent rage had not gone out. I hear the cry of mothers, mothers fearing for children's lives. I hear their lament, how long, and their call to all of us to arise. We are called to open our hearts wide to hear and respond to those cries. And so, my fellow Unitarian Universalists, as we gather this morning, we are asked to choose to bless the world, to recognize and to name beauty and grace, and to keep our hearts open wide to life. And we are called to hear and to respond to injustice, to hear the holy disturbance, and to respond with a benevolent rage. This is the blessing that we take up together, the power that is in every one of our hands as co-creators of this world. What will you do with your gifts? None of us alone can save the world. Together, that is another possibility waiting. Leave this place, may we choose to bless the world. May we bless it with our lives by continuing to keep our hearts open wide. May we name the unspeakable beauty and grace in the midst of brokenness. And may we reach out with nurturing strength and fierce tenderness to heal our broken world. Blessed be. Go in peace, or stay in peace in your homes. And I would invite you to sing along, and our closing hymn is Wake Now, My Senses. It will come up on your screen.